Jim, you have a radiant spirit about you that is contagious, and I keep hoping more of that's going to rub off on me. You're a good influence.
You got shots for that.
You have shots for that? I want to tell you about someone else who has had a spirit much like James will tell, that radiance, that positivity, that energy, that goodness. A 90-year-old woman by the name of Mrs. Sampson, and Jim, you're not a 90-year-old woman by any stretch of the imagination, but that same kind of radiant spirit. And her pastor tells about the time that he would always go to visit her, and he would especially go visit her when he himself was feeling down, because there was just something about her, in spite of the illnesses that she was dealing with, and in spite of all the negativity that surrounded her, she herself was always very positive and just had this happy, contented way about her. And her pastor asked her on one visit, he said, "What is it that keeps you that way?" And she answered with a line that came from a poem. She said this: "I had an hour of glory on a wind-swept hill." Now think about that for a moment. I had an hour of glory on a wind-swept hill. That sounds a lot like what happened to Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration. This morning, I'm going to ask us to climb up a mountain, a very high mountain with narrow trails and strong winds, a mountain that will take us far above the ordinary and the mundane and put us on a place where we can see clearly, where we can think deeply and feel keenly. Mountaintops do that to a person. Mountaintops take us to a place where we are reminded that creation and the God of creation is far grander than the sameness of suburbia or the urgency of the urban. It comes as no surprise that it was on a mountaintop where God gave Moses the 10 Commandments. And it was on a mountaintop where Jesus was transfigured before the apostles Peter, James, and John. We hear about this every year. I personally have listened to many sermons on the Transfiguration, and so have all of you. And I've preached a few myself by this point. And the temptation for many of us mainline preachers is to hurry through the mountaintop. The sermons sound the same every year, that yes, we're on the mountain, but we're not to dwell up there. We're to hurry back down. And we exhort everyone to get down there into the world and to roll up our sleeves and to get busy and to work for the change that we want to see. Because for us, the most important part is doing, and we're not happy unless we're doing. Take a look, though, around historic mainline Protestantism today, not just at St. Paul, but the historic mainline Protestant churches in general. There aren't as many of us as there used to be. And we're actually more gray and silver than we are black, brown, ginger, and blonde. The calendar has not afforded us any exemptions, and we remain subject to the limitations of time and decay. But yet we have insisted on doing for many years, and for good reason, because if it hadn't been for people doing, our churches would not exist today. It takes a lot of doing to keep a church going. It takes a lot of giving and a lot of planning. It takes a lot of commitment, and those are things that we are good at. And so all of these years we have been a doing church. We were always quick to hurry back down from the mountain of Transfiguration, because after all, the world needed saving, and so we needed to roll up our sleeves. I mean, believing is fine, but we're more about caring and doing, and by golly, we have to do that. because we've always been told that that's the priority. This morning I want to challenge that line of thought, at least for a little bit, because I would argue that maybe we don't go to the mountain enough, and maybe we don't stay up there long enough. For I would argue that it is on the mountain where we find our sustenance for doing mission down in the valley. I would argue that we cannot last very long down in the valley until we have spent enough time on the mountain. The point I'm trying to make in that, friends, is that the world has only one Savior, and you and I aren't him. We only work for him. And we are also too quick to hurry down from the mountaintop thinking that we can do what only he can do. We need to stay up there a little bit longer and go there a little bit more often to bask in his glorious, transfigured presence. We need to see Peter's point and put up some dwellings because, yes, it is good for us to be there. In short, to be up on the mountaintop means to be spiritually connected to the person of Christ. It means to remember that he is the one true head of the church, and that everything that we do should be grounded in him, for he is our source of strength. In order to become a minister in most Protestant denominations, you have to go through a lengthy process of examination and interviews, and this culminates in an ordination exam, and they vary from denomination to denomination. I remember mine that I took in the Iowa conference, and it was an oral exam that I had to give in front of a panel of ministers. It can be a little bit unnerving. There was one particular minister that sat on a panel, not on mine, but he told of one that he sat on for over 30 years. And he would examine ministerial candidates for ordination, and he would ask them the same question every single time they came to him. He'd been asking the same question of new seminary grads when they came for their ordination exam. He would ask them to go stand over by the window, and when they saw somebody walking by on the sidewalk, to let him know. And pretty soon the candidate would say, "Yes, I see some person out there." And he would say, "Okay, do you know them personally?" And they would say usually, "Well, no, I don't." And he said, "Good. Now, will you please describe for me that person theologically?" And he said the candidates tended to fall into two main categories. The first category would say, "Well, that person, I see a sinner who is in need of the redemption of Christ." Then he said, but the second category tended to say this. They would say, "That person there, whether they know it or not, they are a child of God, loved and upheld by the grace of God in Jesus Christ." That minister on the panel, he said, "I suppose technically both answers were theologically correct," and they were. He said, "But in my experience, those who gave the second answer tended to make better ministers. And the reason, of course, is that they have the gift of transfiguration discernment. When they look at their fellow human beings, not only do they see a person in the present tense, but they see that person for what that person can become after God has transformed their life and after they've availed themselves to God. They see themselves, that person, as a precious creation in God's future, a beloved child of God. And here's what I'm really trying to say with this to each of you this morning. Whether you know it or not, you are a child of God. You are loved and upheld by the grace of God in Jesus Christ. And you may be thinking to yourself, no way, I can't possibly be. I'm not like the other people at church. My life's a mess. Here's what I want to say again. Whether you know it or not, you are a child of God, loved and upheld by the grace of God in Jesus Christ. And you may be thinking, no, Pastor, you don't know me. I wasn't very nice to my spouse last week. Again, whether you know it or not, you are a child of God, loved and upheld by the grace of God in Jesus Christ. And so is your spouse. But Pastor, I'm always yelling at my kids, and I think thoughts that I shouldn't think, and I say words that I shouldn't say, and I'm not holy. Guess what? We're all a mess. You, whether you know it or not, you are a child of God, loved and upheld by the grace of God in Jesus Christ. Let that soak in. And when you actually realize that, you've been to the mountaintop, and your life is transfigured and transformed, because it is on the mountaintop where we meet Christ. The basis of your life and your every good work should be grounded in the person of Christ, because you are God's child, loved and upheld by the grace of God in Jesus Christ. Yes, you work down in the valley, but you need to draw your strength from the mountain. That's what kept 90-year-old Mrs. Sampson going, that hour she would spend regularly on a windswept hill, that told her pastor and others around her that she indeed had been in the presence of God. And that's what we need as well, as we regularly encounter the one who is transfigured before Peter, James, and John. When we understand that we belong to him regardless, we too will be transformed in the presence of the world. Amen.